We're looking today at one of the most fraught chapters in modern history, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And the enduring puzzle of October 1962 is not really if the U.S. had intelligence on Soviet activity in Cuba.
No, they had mountains of it.
Exactly. The real question is why? Why, with all those resources, all that sensitivity about the Caribbean, was the White House so slow to acknowledge what was happening?
The deployment of nuclear weapons just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland.
It resulted in what was later defined, pretty damningly, as a near-total intelligence surprise.
A surprise. So when the President's Intelligence Board did its postmortem, what did they find?
Well, their report concluded that this surprise was, in large part, from a malfunction of the analytic process.
So the machine worked, but the people didn't.
In a sense, yes. The American intelligence machine gathered all this evidence of unusual activity. I mean, a clear sign the Soviets were doing something big in Cuba.
But the analysts, they failed to deduce the true nature of it, the strategic, the offensive nature of it.
It's a puzzle of interpretation, not of collection.
Okay, let's unpack that malfunction then. If we look at the raw material, say, between July and September of 62.
Well, Western electronic and aerial surveillance, they clearly documented a huge surge of Soviet shipping,
A surge.
a dramatic surge. These vessels were leaving ports in the Barents and Black Seas and, heading straight for Cuba.
And this monitoring effort was pretty vast, I take it.
It was. It ranged from the really high-tech, sophisticated electronic intercepts all the way down to some surprisingly low-tech operations.
What's fascinating is that reliance on the low-tech stuff, even within these huge operations.
It really is. I mean, part of the process for monitoring ships going through the English Channel, it involved chartering a light aircraft,
Just a simple plane.
a simple Cessna, piloted by a 22-year-old named Gordon Janey. He flew out of Lympne in Kent, and he was commissioned by the U.S. Embassy from a little company called Sky Photos.
And his job was
Yeah.
just to take pictures of ships.
Just to photograph the volume of shipping. They knew the flow was increasing, they knew it was unusual, but they had no idea what was actually on board.
And Moscow exploited that ambiguity brilliantly.
Oh, they were exceptionally successful in concealing the true nature of the cargo. We know now that those vessels were carrying tens of thousands of military personnel.
Far more than the CIA was estimating.
Far more. The CIA was estimating around 4,000, and Moscow managed this incredible sleight of hand at sea, hiding people, hiding critical components in these massive disguised crates.
Which brings us to that anecdote, the missed trick on July 20th. It really sort of encapsulates this early failure of analysis.
It does. A Soviet transport plane makes an emergency landing.
In NASA, of all places. In the Bahamas.
Right. And American tourists, intrigued by the sight, they just start enthusiastically photographing these Russians who are clustered on the tarmac, many of them wearing, check shirts.
And the analysts back in Washington.
They failed to realize who they were looking at. These were advance parties of the Soviet missile regiments. General Plev's personal doctor was in that group.
And the importance of that sighting, which was highly visible, fully documented, was just lost.
Completely lost. So the ultimate conservative conclusion drawn by most U.S. analysts at the time was that these huge cargoes were just defensive conventional arms.
Just meant to bolster Fidel Castro's forces. It sounds cautious, but it turned out to be a disastrously wrong assumption.
Well, in isolation, that initial assessment was considered, and I'm quoting here, not unreasonable. You have to remember the context.
The political pressure.
The immense political and strategic context. The Soviets had a clear commitment to protect Cuba, and the Kennedy administration's determination to oust Castro was very well known. Operation Mongoose and all that.
So analysts felt that military reinforcements were just a logical Soviet response to these palpable U.S. threats.
Exactly. It provided a safe, acceptable explanation for all the unusual shipping, and that, in turn, actively constrained their ability to imagine something more audacious, something like a strategic offensive deployment.
So if the conventional wisdom was that they were only seeing defensive weapons, that suggests the analysts couldn't get a clear view of the actual offensive weapon.
That's right. Which takes us into the analytical trenches, to the photo interpreters who were, fighting to see through the deception.
At the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC.
Correct. The staff there were grappling with these images of Soviet merchant vessels. They were specifically trying to figure out what was inside the huge, obscured wooden containers lashed to the decks.
And they came up with a name for this word.
They did. They coined a new term, cretology.
Cratology. It sounds like a made-up academic field, but it was desperately real.
It was. They were essentially trying to conduct a kind of forensic science, just using shadows, trying to guess the shape and contents of a massive object based only on the contours you can see through a heavy tarp, or the shadows cast by wooden bracing.
So they're looking at tie-down patterns, slight shifts in shape, all to try and divine what's inside these containers.
And for weeks, they achieved very, very little success. The Soviets were masters of this kind of obfuscation,
Which forced the intelligence community to rely on other streams of information.
primarily communications intelligence, or SIGINT.
Yep.
And this is where we have to introduce the crucial role played by Juanita Moody.
Moody is a really compelling figure, a veteran codebreaker, one of the few senior women at the National Security Agency.
She was heading the Cuba desk at just 38. Her background is extraordinary. One of 9 children of a railroad worker, grew up in a rented home in rural North Carolina. No electricity, no running water.
Started as a trainee teacher before becoming a crypt panelist at Arlington Hall during the war.
And then a founding member of the NSA in 1952. She was a professional who excelled quickly, especially at exploiting new technologies like the early computers for code breaking.
And she was directing a large, often skeptical staff in an environment of a pretty open male prejudice.
We know of one NSA boss who famously called an office of young women analysts the paint and body shop.
Unbelievable.
Moody was known for her professional rigor, her directness. She would occasionally call her staff to order by whacking a hockey stick on her desk.
Demanding focus.
Immediate focus and results. And soon after she took over the Cuba department in 1961, she and her team noted a crucial shift.
A detrimental intelligence shift.
A step improvement in Cuban communication security, clearly done under Russian tutelage.
And this is a technical failure point we really have to understand.
We do. Cuban wireless traffic, which had been previously pretty easy for U.S. intercept stations to read, suddenly went dark, or became much harder to process.
Because Castro's forces, advised by the Russians, had transitioned to a new system.
A sophisticated, short-range microwave system for a lot of their sensitive communications.
And why was that so devastating for U.S. intelligence?
Well, conventional high-frequency wireless can be intercepted easily from hundreds of miles away. But microwave systems are fundamentally line of sight.
Meaning you have to be very close.
You have to be very close or positioned high up, almost in view of the transmitter. The NSA's large, traditional network was suddenly rendered far less effective. They couldn't penetrate this closed loop of the microwave network across the island.
So the U.S. Navy surveillance ships, like the Oxford, the Belmont, the Liberty, which were deployed offshore, they were basically handicapped.
Severely handicapped. They couldn't gather critical operational details, so they were forced to just watch as these Soviet vessels docked at Cuban ports.
Arriving with blank cargo manifests.
Blank manifests, declared weights that didn't match the tonnage, and all the important offloads were happening clandestinely, only in darkness.
And all this secrecy, combined with the loss of clear SIGINT, it all contributed to Juanita Moody's alarm.
It did. She recalled afterwards that things were getting hotter and hotter. She said that by early 1962, she was really getting scared.
Her professional judgment told her something was fundamentally changing.
Something strategic. And her alarm was significant enough that in February 1962, an unprecedented top-secret NSA assessment of the Soviet buildup was released to the wider intelligence community.
And that assessment specifically highlighted the agency's deep concern that all this secrecy implied a strategic objective.
That's right. So the SIGINT community, the codebreakers, they were flashing red alarms very early on, even while the photo interpreters were still stuck in the frustrating world of cryptology.
But the photographic evidence did eventually provide that critical circumstantial piece.
Yes, the situation crystallized in the first week of August. Construction began on Soviet SAM anti-aircraft missile launcher sites.
At Matanzas, Havana, Muriel, several locations.
Right. And when the CIA's Strategic Thinking Cell, the Office of National Estimates, or one identified those weapons, the Soviet cover story that they were only shipping agricultural equipment was definitively blown.
And this is where analytical deduction finally starts to pull ahead of hard proof.
It is. CIA Deputy Director Lyman Lemnitzer recalled his boss, John McCone, looking at the growing network of these anti-aircraft sites and asking the critical question.
The question that shifted the analysis.
They're preventing aerial intrusion to protect something. Now, what the hell is it?
That's the core piece of logic McCone drove home.
It is. The analysts recognized that SAMs were expensive. They were scarce resources for the Soviet Union at that time. They were used to protect high-value strategic assets.
Things like nuclear plants, major command centers, missile silos.
Exactly. Assets which Cuba lacked. So the presence of SAMs strongly implied that something far more important, something strategic, and likely something offensive was being shielded.
This deductive reasoning was backed by a trickle of human intelligence, human from refugees and exile.
Though those reports were often treated with a lot of skepticism, of course.
High noise-to-signal ratio from the exile community.
Always.
Mhm.
But McCone, the CIA director, he emerged as the intellectual hawk in this initial phase. He was relentless in pursuing his deduction.
Between August 10th and 23rd, he gave President Kennedy 4 separate warnings.
4 warnings, stating his personal conviction that the Soviets intended to deploy strategic offensive missiles in Cuba. He was virtually alone in this belief among the senior cabinet.
And he was met with immediate, powerful opposition.
At an NSC meeting on August 17th, Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, they strongly disagreed. They argued the buildup was only for conventional defenses. McCone was a lonely dissenting voice.
We should probably spend a moment on the character of John McCone. His background, his biases, they really influenced his deduction and, of course, the reaction to it.
Absolutely. He was a 60-year-old, ultra-conservative California Republican, a political appointee, not a career intelligence officer.
And Robert Kennedy had actually promoted his appointment.
He did. It was part of a strategy of reassurance to win over conservatives after the Bay of Pigs humiliation. They wanted a figure who would get things done.
He certainly had a controversial reputation, a businessman who'd prospered massively during World War II from shipbuilding.
Which led to a scandalous investigation. A congressional watchdog testified after the war that McCone and his associates had made $44 million from an initial investment of just $100,000.
Raising serious questions about war profiteering.
A representative from the General Accounting Office even parodied Churchill during the investigation, saying, "At no time in the history of American business have so few men made so much money with so little risk, and all at the expense of the taxpayer."
So this background framed him as a ruthless industrialist, a political conservative.
And someone who viewed the Cold War in stark existential terms of good versus absolute evil. And this was tied directly to his strategic thinking.
He had a historic and fierce enthusiasm for nuclear weapons.
He did. In 1956, for instance, when Caltech scientists supported a test ban treaty, McCone publicly asserted they'd been deceived by Russian propaganda and were trying to create fear in the minds of the uninformed.
He saw communism as fundamentally evil and was a firm believer in massive nuclear retaliation.
Which meant that for him, the idea of the Soviets putting offensive missiles in Cuba wasn't just plausible, it was strategically likely. It fit his worldview.
On August 22nd, he formalized his position. He submitted a detailed memo to Kennedy speculating on the likelihood of MRBMs.
Medium-range ballistic missiles. And the next day, he again insisted that the SAM deployments were only credible if they were protecting strategic MRBMs, while admitting it was a judgment call, thus far unsupported by evidence.
He summed up his method pretty well himself.
He said, "We didn't see the offensive missiles, but some things you can deduce."
And here's the great irony. McCone, the first and most vocal hawk on this.
He leaves Washington later that same day, August 23rd, for a month-long honeymoon in France with his new wife.
Incongruously accompanied by a CIA communications team.
The implication of his absence is telling. Despite his 4 urgent warnings, his decision to disappear for a month suggested he didn't anticipate an imminent high noon.
He saw it as a developing threat, not an immediate crisis that demanded his presence.
Right. And what's more, he'd inadvertently damaged his own credibility at those late August meetings. He proposed a faked Castroist assault on Guantanamo Bay as a pretext for an invasion.
That kind of hawkish overreach might have made the more cautious Kennedy team even more hesitant to accept his missile deduction.
It likely did. But while the CIA director was away, the intelligence failure he predicted was about to be forced into the open by mounting political pressure.
Which brings us to the period where the White House was forced to confront all this circumstantial evidence.
And we have to examine why the administration was so reluctant to heed any of it, even from the CIA director.
Well, they had a decent case for caution. The intelligence establishment had been wrong before, alarmist even.
The CIA chiefs were the architects of the supreme folly of the Bay of Pigs, just 19 months prior. The shadow of that defeat made caution seem like a strategic necessity.
And the Humint pipeline was notoriously unreliable.
Constantly. Cuban exile informants were always trying to goad the U.S. into an invasion, which made their information very difficult to credit immediately.
And strategically, Kennedy wanted détente with the Soviet Union, not trouble.
He'd replaced the word enemy with adversary in his inaugural speech. He was actively trying to de-escalate, not provoke a crisis.
But the ultimate reason for their caution was just sheer strategic astonishment.
It was. Khrushchev's nuclear deployment in Cuba was an extraordinary break, with a custom Soviet strategic caution. They had never placed strategic missiles outside the Soviet bloc before.
So some of the shrewdest thinkers in the West, after the missiles were revealed, admitted they were genuinely astonished.
Astonished at Moscow's recklessness. It seemed illogical to them that Khrushchev would take such a monumental, world-ending risk.
This reluctance to believe was also complicated by the very aggressive and visible U.S. military posture in the region.
That's a key point. In the fall of '62, America's armed forces, especially the Air Force, were consumed with impatience to assault Cuba.
General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff, he unilaterally mandated a clandestine Cuba Attack Command Center at Homestead Air Force Base.
A clear sign of pre-positioning. And we know from the research that this covert buildup went deep. Lieutenant General Jack Merrill described going to Congress behind the scenes to reprogram funds for equipment in Florida.
Explicitly to avoid raising too much public awareness about their plans against Cuba.
And the military exercises were overt. Marine landing teams practiced amphibious assaults on VX Island.
Against a fictional dictator named Ortsac.
Castro spelled backwards. And the carriers, Essex, Independence, and Enterprise were all deploying to the Caribbean as Task Force 135.
So the inescapable conclusion, even before the deployment was revealed, was that the Kennedy administration couldn't really object to a Soviet buildup.
As long as it was designed to protect Castro. Kennedy's central error was assuming Khrushchev would be deterred by warnings, rather than using them as political cover for something much more aggressive.
And the issue was finally forced onto the White House agenda, not by intelligence, but by politics.
By Republican Senator Kenneth Keating of New York. He began making insistent public claims about Soviet ballistic missile deployment, citing unnamed sources.
Keating's sources were never identified. Possibly disgruntled defense or intelligence figures, Cuban refugees.
Or maybe the former West German ambassador to Cuba, Karl von Spredy, who the CIA had earlier dismissed as a fantasist.
Regardless, Keating kept the issue alive in the press, forcing the White House to respond before the November elections.
And the political heat intensified after an August 29th U-2 flight showed 8 new SAM sites. Kennedy knew he had to manage the fallout.
He ordered the acting CIA Director, Pat Carter, to put the U-2 images in the box and nail it shut.
To maintain tight secrecy. But the political threat meant silence was no longer an option.
Which brings us to the crucial decision point on September 4th. The White House met twice to draft a public response to Keating.
These were vital meetings. They set the policy parameters for the crisis to come. They defined what would be an intolerable act.
Ruskin McNamara, initially cautious, now supported the idea that a significant offensive capability would warrant immediate and appropriate action.
They discussed asking Congress for authority to call up reserve forces to send a clear public signal.
And McNamara, ever the systems analyst, was thinking ahead.
He was. He urged them to formulate a clear response before things developed further. He warned against making a public statement until they knew exactly what weapons were there.
And he pressed them on the need for immediate action, asking if they were considering a future naval blockade, why wouldn't we do it today?
And the president immediately interjected with the core global risk. Because we figure they may try to blockade Berlin.
Kennedy made it clear that the U.S. response to Cuba couldn't be separated from the more immediate confrontation point in Europe.
That fear of losing West Berlin was the political anchor that was tethering U.S. action on Cuba.
Kennedy then explicitly defined his red line. He said surface-to-surface missiles or a nuclear base would violate our national security.
He stressed to congressional leaders later that they had to keep some proportion. He said, "We are not talking about nuclear warheads." He thought the Berlin crisis would climax that fall, and he wasn't willing to impale the U.S. on Cuba prematurely.
Senator Richard Russell captured the domestic political mood perfectly.
He did. He warned Kennedy that public opinion was intensely focused on Cuba because, unlike Berlin, it's in the nature of an offense to the national pride. It's so close.
That national pride demanded a show of strength. When Kennedy proposed calling up 150,000 reserves, Senator Dirksen insisted the move had to be explicitly linked to Cuba to appease public sentiment.
Which shows how intertwined domestic politics were with intelligence management.
So that evening, September 4th, Press Secretary Pierre Salinger read the White House statement.
It detailed the Soviet buildup, the MiGs, the SAMs, but explicitly stated there was no evidence of offensive weapons threatening the U.S.
That public statement set the fundamental policy. Defensive arms were tolerable. Offensive arms were the line that, if crossed, guaranteed confrontation.
But while the administration was making these public assurances, they were being systematically deceived through a private back channel.
Through Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, he was the point man for deniable talks.
Relying heavily on Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin and, crucially, a man named Colonel Georgy Bolshakov.
Bolshakov was the TASE chief, the head of the Soviet news agency.
But he was actually a fluent English-speaking GRU colonel, a military intelligence operative. And RFK developed this extraordinary, and you could argue, naive trust in this channel. He met Bolshakov 51 times.
And this is where you have to question RFK's judgment. He cultivated this relationship despite explicit warnings from U.S. intelligence that the Russian was just peddling disinformation.
He wanted to believe he had a privileged, trusting relationship. He was perhaps choosing to believe the source that confirmed his own bias towards seeking a peaceful resolution.
On September 4th, RFK expressed his acute concern to Dobrinin about the missile rumors.
Dobrinin sought instructions from Moscow and received a definitive lie. You should confirm that there are only defensive Soviet weapons in Cuba.
And identical instructions, tied personally to Khrushchev's name, were given to Bolshakov to deliver.
Kit Sorensen later wrote that RFK felt personally deceived by these lies. Khrushchev had chosen to bankrupt the burgeoning trust between the two countries.
Believing the strategic prize in Cuba was worth the enormous cost of that deception.
History tells us Khrushchev was playing a deeply reckless game. While he was meeting American officials and assuring them he wouldn't raise tensions, in Moscow, he was planning a radical escalation.
On September 7th, he approved a recommendation to reinforce the force with IL-28 nuclear-capable bombers, tactical Luna missiles, and FKR-1 cruise missiles.
A direct, defiant response to Kennedy's public warning just 3 days earlier.
This represented a profound shift into the nuclear warfighting domain. These weren't just strategic deterrents.
No, these were operational tactical nuclear weapons. They dramatically increased the risk of catastrophic consequences from any local clash. The Luna missile, for example, it's a short-range battlefield weapon designed to destroy troop concentrations or beachheads.
And the order sent to General Pliev, the Soviet commander in Cuba, they explicitly avowed the prospect of using these nuclear arms.
A stunning September 8th message authorized Pliev to make his own decision to use the nuclear means of the Luna, the IL-28, or the FKR-1
as instruments of local warfare.
For the destruction of the enemy, should contact with Moscow be lost during an American amphibious landing.
That is the single most terrifying detail. The use of tactical nukes was not dependent on Moscow.
It was in the hands of a general in the field, authorized to initiate nuclear war if he lost contact during an invasion. That centralization of lethal power in the hands of a theater commander, it raises the frightening possibility of accidental war.
As this deception unfolded, the struggle for intelligence continued in Washington, specifically over aerial surveillance.
McCone, back from his honeymoon, immediately ordered daily U-2 surveillance flights.
An instruction that was immediately countermanded by Rusk and McNamara.
They feared a shootdown. A Chinese nationalist U-2 had just been destroyed over the mainland on September 8th. They argued McCone lacked the authority to order such provocative flights.
And the tension over this refusal to fly led to open conflict.
Brutal conflict. During a September 10th meeting, Rusk again expressed his unease, and RFK stared at him and demanded, "What's the matter, Dean, you chicken?"
The pressure was immense, and the analytical side was also lagging.
The CIA's crystal-gazing cell, 1, led by Sherman Kent, issued an 18th of September assessment that directly questioned McCone's deduction.
Their latest Special National Intelligence Estimate, the SNIE.
It found it more plausible that the Soviets were building a submarine base. Kent argued that the analytical process required more than a hunch. He said, "We can't just tell the president that we think the Soviets will put missiles in Cuba because Khrushchev is a son of a bitch."
The assessment concluded that deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba would be incompatible with Soviet practice to date.
And a crucial blind spot emerged from this caution. An analyst named Kenneth Absher noted that the one group issued this assessment on the critical but false assumption that regular successful U-2 flights were taking place.
Which they weren't. No successful flights had happened over the critical western areas of Cuba where the missiles were being installed.
The analysis was based on incomplete intelligence due to political timidity.
But despite the analytical resistance and operational paralysis, the human reports started to trickle in.
A September 9th encounter with Castro's pilot, circulated on the 20th, claimed 40-mile range guided missiles and mini mobile ramps for intermediate range rockets. This finally convinced analyst Kenneth Apsher that McCone had been right.
And other reports followed. A refugee claimed to have seen 20 trucks with long trailers and sketched missile-shaped artifacts that matched the SS-4.
By October 1st, another snippet reported a large area in Pinar del Rio province had been declared a restricted military zone for very secret and important work believed to be concerned with missiles.
The combined weight of the human was finally aligning with McCone's deduction.
And pressures were mounting daily. London Times reports were headlined, "Cuba dominating American elections." The pressure for action became irresistible.
On October 9th, the policy group finally conceded. They agreed to 4 brief north-south U-2 overflights.
Targeting the western portion of the island and another area pinpointed by HUMINT.
And the risk was quantifiable and immense.
Colonel Jack Lidford, the CIA Special Activities Director, briefed the group that the estimated risk to a U-bird from Soviet SAMs was about 1 in 6.
A terrifyingly high probability of losing a pilot and triggering a catastrophic escalation. But the political necessity outweighed the operational risk.
And even at this critical moment, a petulant dispute arose between the CIA and the Air Force over who should fly the missions.
A turf war.
A ridiculous turf war. Ultimately, Air Force pilots flew because if a plane was lost, it was deemed unacceptable for the CIA civilians to be found aboard. The military pilots were seen as more expendable.
So the focus shifted to the man chosen for the mission, 35-year-old Major Steve Heiser, a decorated Korean combat veteran.
He was flown to Edwards Air Force Base. His aircraft was a U-2F, a CIA plane hastily repainted as USA 66675, fitted with higher thrust engines designed to reach 72,500 feet.
Heiser lifted off late on October 13th for the Brass Knob mission, #3101, maintaining total radio silence.
He met the sun over the Gulf of Mexico and penetrated denied territory, flying at maximum altitude, constantly scanning for Cuban fighters or an SA-2 missile.
The onboard technology was incredible. The large B camera carried 5,000 feet of film,
producing these huge 9-by-9-inch frames and achieving an astounding resolution. Objects less than 3 feet square were distinguishable on the ground.
The single pass over western Cuba lasted just 7 minutes. Heiser landed 7 hours after takeoff, having exposed 928 frames.
The logistics then introduced a brief, absurd bottleneck. The film canisters were hand-carried to Washington, but upon landing, a 30-minute turf squabble occurred when the officers sent to get the film weren't on the authorized recipients list.
Unbelievable, even then.
Even then. The pictures finally reached NPIC in the Stewart Building above an auto showroom on Monday morning, October 15th.
And the tension inside that center must have been palpable.
3 two-man teams, led by a 33-year-old CIA analyst named Vince Dorenzo, scrutinized the images. It was Dorenzo who focused instantly on the extraordinary length of the big tubes visible at the Soviet sites.
Clearly, much larger than the SAMs they'd seen before.
Much larger. And this is where the technical intelligence provided by Colonel Oleg Penkovsky became absolutely critical.
The GRU officer and double agent.
He'd supplied 111 rolls of film, including 10,000 pages of documents. Critically, this included the operating manuals and schematics for the SS-4 and SS-5 missiles.
So his data didn't just tell them the shape of the missile. It provided the dimensions, the deployment protocols.
Everything. A missile expert named Jay Quantrill then found archive pictures of Soviet SS-4 MRBMs being towed through Moscow May Day parades. The tubes snapped by Major Heiser were an astonishing match.
This technical intelligence allowed them to definitively assess the weapons, confirming they were missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads across the entire southeastern U.S.
At 5:30 p.m. on October 15th, Dorenzo informed his chief, Arthur Lundahl, "We've got MRBMs in Cuba." The moment of total, undeniable confirmation had arrived.
The trauma that struck that tightly restricted circle in Washington was intense. Shock and anger.
American leaders felt they had made the cardinal error of trusting Soviet assurances. They concluded Khrushchev was trying to make a simpleton of Kennedy.
In a moment of deep historical irony, as this discovery was being confirmed, Robert Kennedy was presiding over a review of Operation Mongoose.
The CIA's year-old, highly aggressive program dedicated to overthrowing Castro. A massive, costly, and systemically incompetent operation.
600 CIA personnel, many more contract people, costing $50 million a year.
The operation was overseen by veteran Bill Harvey, whose effectiveness was impaired by advanced alcoholism. The program included repeated, often absurd, attempts to kill Castro, revealing the CIA as risibly incompetent counter-revolutionaries.
And RFK, reviewing Mongoose, expressed the president's extreme dissatisfaction that so little had been achieved. The contrast was stark.
Billions spent on intelligence and covert ops, yet the agency had missed the greatest strategic threat of the Cold War.
The immediate reaction from the military, once informed, was for massive, preemptive escalation.
General Thomas Power, SAK's commander-in-chief, he recommended that we should destroy their air order of battle and invade, even before the missiles were fully confirmed as operational.
Kennedy had to manage this military impulse. He told the Joint Chiefs he wanted no military action within 3 months, but added that he can't be sure because he does not control events.
And crucially, throughout these high-level discussions, there was a complete and profound absence of the Cuban perspective.
American decision-makers assumed the Cubans were just hapless prisoners and puppets of the Soviet Union.
Their real thoughts or wishes were never discussed, despite the potential for their extinction in the event of a U.S. strike.
The Cuban view, however, was rooted in national sovereignty. A man named Ciro Bianchi, a teenager at the time, asserted that Cubans had a strong conviction and great fervor rooted in trust for Fidel Castro.
Believing Cuba, as a sovereign power, had the right to sanction the missile installation, just as NATO allies hosted U.S. missiles.
The U.S. failed to recognize their adversary's motivation as anything other than Moscow's manipulation.
Ultimately, the U.S., despite spending billions on defense and intelligence, relied chiefly on cables from foreign missions for knowledge about Havana. The quality of intelligence on the internal decision-making and motivations of their adversaries was poor.
And despite the intelligence trauma and the systemic failures, the final reflection has to be on the quality of the White House discussions during the 13 days.
Yes, these involved men of high abilities, prudently reflecting on choices that risked nuclear war. This is highly impressive when you compare it to the secretive, reckless nature of the contemporary Kremlin debates.
Where Khrushchev was playing a dangerous and decentralized game with General Plev's authorization to strike, the discovery forced America's leaders to engage in the most crucial strategic calculation of the Cold War, despite, and perhaps because of, that near-total intelligence surprise.
The debate often focuses on the final week of brinkmanship, but the real story is the analytical failure that allowed it to happen. If intelligence had been perfect, would Kennedy have been more reckless in August, or would Khrushchev have been more cautious in September? That's a question for you to mull or explore on your own.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available right now. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.